Okay, in our last video, we began to introduce the religions that came out of China, and we're primarily interested in Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Uh, in that video, we also gave a kind of overview of Confucianism and Taoism and tried to think about them in terms of yin-yang values, arguing that Confucianism is a kind of yang teaching and Taoism is a teaching that emphasizes yin values. In this video, I'd like to go more specifically into what Confucius's teaching was all about. Primarily, we're going to focus on deliberate tradition, and this was his solution to the compelling problem of his age. If we think of Confucianism as a yang teaching or a yang philosophy or maybe religion, this is a very good example of that way of thinking about it. So let's take a look. The problem that Confucius and others faced during his time was that the social order had gradually disintegrated in China. There was so much division and so much conflict between states that everyone realized that the country was on the verge of major catastrophe in terms of social order. So there were people thinking about what was the best way to rectify the situation. So Confucius had his solution, which we're referring to as deliberate tradition, but there were competing theories. One was the legalist, who had a very practical or realistic answer to the problem, and that would be making use of force to get people to be obedient to the laws and to behave properly. That was kind of an exterior solution and required the existence of a standing militia to enforce all the laws that would need to be passed, or a kind of standing police organization. So that was not desirable, even though that solution was implemented for a time in ancient China. The other theory was more positive, which was the theory of the Mohists, who believed that in the basic goodness of human beings and thought that appealing to their finer instincts, love in particular, would be the way to solve the problem. But for Confucius's viewpoint, that was not very practical and too idealistic. So what was this deliberate tradition that Confucius wanted to invoke? He found what he was looking for in earlier history of China, and he was a great student of history. And he greatly admired the period that could be referred to as Golden Age of ancient China, which existed around 1000 BCE, during the time of the Zhou dynasty. This dynasty, in his view, was based on a very positive set of values, and that he wished to revive. He believed that if these values could be deliberately promoted to the point of being accepted as traditions or traditional, that his aim would have been accomplished. So you don't have to have a lot of laws which are kind of enforcing good behavior from outside. If you can convince people in the appropriateness of
the ideals that you have through traditions. Then the ideals become internalized, and there's no need for external force. People kind of govern themselves more. The big question, of course, is how do you get people to buy into these ideals that you believe would be beneficial if people did buy into them. So how to establish traditions. Ordinarily, traditions are established over a long period of time, but here he wants to deliberately pick what the best ideals would be, and again deliberately try to instill them in the minds of people. So the program involved promoting these ideals primarily through educational programs, and acknowledging or recognizing that you really have to start with the young. It's hard to change the hearts and minds of adults, but the young you can. But even in order to get the program started, you would have to have the agreements of government leaders, to implement such a plan. And Confucius had faced a lot of resistance, and it wasn't really until after his lifetime that his teachings were taken up and implemented in a major way. So all the traditional ways in which values are passed on were made use of in this program. You say these, whatever the socialization or enculturation mechanisms that sort of get us to believe in and accept, the norms of our society, our cultures, and so forth. So that's passed on through families, peers, governments, religions, education, stories, anecdotes, heroes, and saints. All of that was made use of. Well, the first of the ideals is spelled Jen, but I think the pronunciation is Ren, so it's a little unusual. But Ren is the supreme virtue in this set of ideals that Confucius is trying to instill. Ren is, we say, the supreme virtue is kind of the foundation of all the rest. It has to do with the relationship between one person and another, in a direct kind of relationship. You'd say that relationship is based on empathy. It's not based on rationality or ideas exactly. It's based on the ability to be able to feel what another person feels. You might say this is fellow feeling or sympathy, feeling with another person. But this ability to feel what it's like to be treated a certain way kind of acts to govern us in terms of how we relate to other people. And we treat other people the way we want to be treated. And this is a kind of humanness. Be a human being, treat other people as human beings, humanness in relationship with others. Human-heartedness is a term that's used to describe this ideal as well. It's not the first time, it's not the last time that we'll hear this reference to the heart, because that is certainly a big part of what Confucius was trying to promote. If Ren is a virtue that is aimed at in relationships with other people, Chun Tzu is a virtue that applies to everybody as individuals, everyone as individuals. So we mentioned before in a previous video on that there is this kind of duty almost, to develop yourself as much as you can as a human being, to work in the direction of self-perfection. So here this is comes up again, and the idea is that we should all strive to become what is called a superior person, a man or a woman, to become mature, fully developed within ourselves, and uh, up to the point of being a sage. I like the idea of being mature, just grown up, and in all different aspects of ourselves. This person is somebody who has reached a stage where they're comfortable with themselves. You could say that they're at home in themselves, and they're also at home or comfortable in the world. Because reaching this state, inner state, such a person can, if you interact with them, can give you the whole of their attention because they're open to you, and they don't have anything that they're trying to prove or don't have any axe to grind. So they can be there with the whole of themselves in front of others. So again, a kind of openness. And finally, the heart term comes in again. Here, this person, Junsu, is big-hearted. And again, the idea of emotional openness to others. The third ideal is Li, and literally that's propriety, or say Li has to do with the right way of doing things. So this section corresponds maybe more with what we would think ordinary morality has to do with. The right way of doing things, again, has to be passed on. You give people examples so they can see what it looks like to behave in the right way, and examples are provided by heroes and stories, saints, maxims, anecdotes that are passed on, through our enculturation process. Second item here is what's called the rectification of names. And again, you say that here, this involves the idea that names of things, or in particular, names of roles that we have in society, that there should be some moral characteristics that go along with the name. So, you said, for example, what's a father? It's not just a biological determination, but a father is somebody who loves and nurtures his child. So it's like whatever role you have in society, whatever name you give to it, there are moral expectations involved in that, in order for you to truly be that person, or that fulfill that role. Third item here is the doctrine of the mean, similar to what Aristotle had to say about what the right way to act is. And usually that was, to avoid extremes, everything in moderation, not too much and not too little, but just the right amount of a particular way of acting. And to have this rule helps us avoid becoming fanatical. And it also helps us seek compromises if we buy into it. Continuing with this, the values endorsed by Li and social roles that we all have. Say Confucius identified 5 basic constant relationships, he called them, that every society sort of has, and the society is kind of based on. So that first relationship is the relationship between parents and their children. Second, between husbands and wives. Third, between older siblings and younger siblings. 4, between older friends and younger friends. And 5, between rulers and their subjects. So these are social roles that anyone could find themselves involved in almost any society. And for him, there's sort of moral expectations on each side of these relationships. We'll look at that in the next slide. For now, we can note that 3 of these have to do with family. And we say 1, 2, and 3 all have to do with relationships within a family. And here, children's respect is crucial from the beginning. And in general, respect for age is endorsed. So taking care of the aged and respecting the wisdom that comes from experience, and having a rule or an ideal like this within a society would make it easier for people to age. And it's an interesting contrast between our own culture, where there's kind of celebration of youth, and it's harder for people to age, and people are always, instead of accepting age, are trying to stay young. Well, here we have the moral obligations on each side of the 5 constant relationships. The obligation of parents is to love and nurture their children. Children are obliged to treat their parents with reverence. The second one is maybe a little more harder to accept, but I mean, in sort of the changing roles between husbands and wives, according to Confucius, husbands are supposed to be good, wives are supposed to be good listeners. So we might think of that relationship a little differently in the contemporary times. Within the family, older siblings are expected to be gentle with their younger siblings. And again, younger siblings are supposed to be respectful to the elders. And again, you think if you have siblings, I mean, what's the basis for your relationship with them? How do you feel or treat other family members? So Confucius still wants to give some preference to age, but there has to be, respect on the part of the younger, gentleness on the part of the older. Also in friendships, this one always struck me as a little odd, to have younger friends and older friends. I mean, we all have situations like that. Usually we think of our friends as our peers, similar in age to us. But here, again, the older is supposed to be considerate of the younger, and the younger is supposed to defer to the older. The last one is pretty significant. I mean, what's the expectation of a ruler in a state? So there's always going to be rulers and subjects, or citizens, however you want to say it. And we expect of the rulers that they really care about the welfare of their subjects, and that so they're supposed to be benevolent and not to be just thinking about themselves, but to thinking about the welfare of the citizens or the subjects. Subjects, on their part, are supposed to be loyal. And you could say, but contained within this is the idea that if the ruler's doesn't act like a ruler, then the subject doesn't look like he has to be loyal. I mean, so there's this interesting relationship here, and that you want people, and Confucius really pushed this, for leaders, that they should really be for the people. Again, this stuff about family and age, these are 2 interesting features of the whole thing. I think if you look at these relationships, another thing that can be said about them is that there's don't know whether I mentioned this later, but there's kind of inequities in terms of power here. So you say the rulers, always have more power than the subjects do. So it's kind of the inequity in power sort of needs to be balanced with some sort of moral obligation so that power is not abused. If you're in a social role where you have more power than someone on the other side, there's some moral obligations that are supposed to control that relationship to keep things from getting out of hand. In each case, you'd say the older has more power over the older siblings, older friends, and so forth. But the moral obligations are you don't abuse that inequity, but you sort of have a moral obligation to be fair and just. Same thing goes for husbands and wives. China was clearly a patriarchal society where the husband probably had the last word, but just because he's in that position doesn't mean he can abuse it. And also parents, are clearly in a position of superior power over children, but they need to love and nurture, and children need to be respectful. So that's an interesting aspect of these rules, a way of governing inequities of power that occur in society. The last thing on this is the same word, li, although it means propriety, which we said at the beginning, it is also can be interpreted to mean ritual and expanded to the level of ritual. And in Confucianism, a lot of these regulations or these moral demands that are made on people became ritualized. And in a way, Confucius was trying to govern, the whole of society. Every aspect of life could be ritualized. So, play on words, say doing the right thing was doing what was right in the sense of a ritual. So, and in that respect, there was one quote I read somewhere, maybe it's in our text, I can't remember, but where somebody said of Confucius, if the mat wasn't straight, the master wouldn't sit. So everything had to be just so, in this culture, and it was all kind of highly organized. There were lots of rules and lots of regulations. And although China thrived underneath this model, in other respect, it suffered from it as well. Now the last two ideals, the fourth and the fifth, are te and then wen. Te I've already commented on, I think, and it does have to do, te is a Chinese term that is for power, and we'll see coming up soon when we look at Taoism, the major text in Taoism is the Tao Te Ching, and te is in the center, so the literal translation of the Tao Te Ching is the way and its power. But here we're talking about the power that exists in society, and we've already commented upon it, and maybe most significantly, this ideal refers to the power to rule politically, which we said is involves the relationship between the ruler and the subject. There has to be some moral restraint on the ruler, and when the ruler is restrained in themselves and really cares about the welfare of the people, then the subjects are expected to be loyal to the ruler. And we also commented on all the other inequities of power in the social relationships involved in the five constant relationships. The last one is interesting, that Confucius had a very wide range of interest, and he was in particular interested in the arts and music, poetry, painting, and so forth. And he really believed that these were referred to as the arts of peace, and that this is really what was the final measure of a culture, was its artistic achievements. And so in the aesthetic and the spiritual realm, and its philosophy, its ideas, and its music, poetry, and painting, etc., that ultimately this is what would win out over, you could measure the importance of a society by its military achievements or its economic success and so forth, but ultimately what was most lasting were the level of the arts that were attained within a particular culture. And again, this makes me think of the role of the arts in our own culture, and it seems like we don't measure up in this regard.